Hello everyone, welcome to the first in a series of lectures on affect theory. This is just to situate where we are. These approaches really come out of the material we looked at last term on the body, related to also the weeks on psychology in some way, and really the kind of key words this week are about our emotion, sensation, and also like physiology, how the body works, and also images. We're going to talk about images because a lot of our affect, the way we feel and react to certain things, yes, obviously to text, literary text, but also very much to visual imagery and visual text. So we're going to dip into photography in particular. So without further ado, let me get started. And I'm using instead of my big setup, I'm using my laptop. So hopefully this will go all right. Okay, affect, So the background or the theoretical context to this, why are we studying it in this course? Really the story begins in the mid-1990s when affect theory emerges with certain key figures, some of whom you may read if you follow this, an interest in affect further, perhaps in a couple of years' time when you do your dissertation. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick with Adam Frank sometimes, Brian Masumi and Deleuze and Guattari, and there are other thinkers, but those are some of the key ones. So there was this theory sort of comes out of the work of an otherwise not sort of little known, I guess, these days, a psychologist named Sylvan Tompkins, who published this enormous sort of volumes on affect in the mid-20th century. And if you go further to think about how all of these different theoretical approaches are situated, what are the relationships between them, you might think about affect theory as in some way, a reaction to Marxist approaches, a reaction to post-structuralist approaches or deconstruction, because those arguably, if I can generalize, look at structures and systems, economic systems and language systems and all of that, and in some ways are seen sometimes, I'm really hedging here because we just don't want to generalize, but they were seen by some people to be moving away from the body and embodiment and the really important things like how we are engaged sympathetically, how our feelings are engaged and how that makes us act and react, and how all kinds of things that happen with our bodies are related to that, blushing, sweating, fear, shaking, all that kind of stuff. Shaking. Eugenie Brinkma has put it this way: why have so many turned toward affect in the first place, she asks. Why this meta-turn? And as she answers her own question, she says it's part of a larger reawakening of interest in problematics of embodiment and materiality. So there is this sort of blossoming in the 1990s and later, and it's still there in this stuff in flesh, nerves, blood, all this stuff that we live in. How embodiment fits with our engagements with text, with writing, reading, and reacting to text. Okay, so one of the things I hate doing is defining what are really nebulous terms. And there's lots of discussion about what is exactly affect, how is it different than feelings and emotions? And there are many different definitions and a lot of debate and discussion and disagreement about it. And I'll throw some out here for you. Brian Masumi says affect is an ability to affect, that is to have an effect on someone or something and to be affected. And I think the repetition of those terms is to get us thinking about how perhaps one of the differences between emotion and feeling is that affect, it does something. It does something. It has a reaction or action that we can point to. It is a pre-personal intensity, he says. And I think here he's getting us to think about how it is in the body, like intensities. They are felt things that correspond to the passage from one experiential state of the body to another. And again, experiential state is getting us to think about how we are always, so I'm conscious right now that I'm moving my hands a lot. I'm conscious that this is a really uncomfortable stool. I'm conscious that I am right now wearing my yoga trousers and that I really should exercise later on today. I'm conscious that I just saw my hair at the corner of my eye. I need a haircut really, really badly. I'm conscious that I've started wearing glasses in the last year and it really irritates me. We live in bodies and we're constantly aware of ourselves in bodies, even when we are really, really intellectual. And this implies, he says, an augmentation, an addition to or diminution, bringing down that body's capacity to act. So there's something here about embodiment and acting and feeling and making people feel, but that has a real observable action or reaction attached to it. Feelings are personal and biographical. Now this is interesting because if you notice, Masumi has said it's pre-personal. And here we have Schuss saying feelings are personal and biographical, emotions are social, and affects are pre-personal. So there's something here about the individual and identity. So this pre-personal intensity that Masumi talks about, and this sense that affects are pre-personal that Schuss also says, is against feelings which are really individualistic in some senses. They are based upon our experiences, our own biographies, our own situatedness, where we come from, where we're at, and all the things, the zillion uncountable things that have happened to us to shape who we are. And emotions are social. And what they mean by that is that emotions are dependent upon the time period, the historical context where you or one is. If they're in the 18th century in England or the 17th century in Alaska, which didn't exist then, didn't exist under that name, or somewhere in Australia in the 1960s, or Africa in the 1980s, or whatever it might be. Those cultures, those places, those times, those climates all have emotional lives that are specific to those contexts. So a lot of what we feel is dependent upon how we are socialized. So obviously, for instance, if you think about blushing, which is a bodily affect, that comes from an emotion, say like shame, which comes from how your society at a given time conceives of, say, nudity. So if being naked is normal and everyone does it, then you don't blush, you don't feel shame. If everyone wears clothes and to be naked is absolutely unusual, then you would blush and feel really awkward and perhaps sweat. Okay, so feelings are sensations, we could say. Emotions are manifestations of feelings. And then there's something else, which is affect. Okay, so 3, the other thing to think about is this cultural history of affect. Now, as I've repeated ad nauseum, affect comes from, and it has to do with the body. So way back, we started to have a term the term sensation, we started to use it when we started to understand how the nervous system worked in the body. So way back in the 17th century, the anatomist Thomas Willis, for instance, wrote Pathology of the Brain. John Locke wrote Essay on Human Understanding in 1690, where he talks a lot about, how we are tabula rasa, and that who we become, our identities are really situated in the body. These are kind of two pivotal texts that really forwarded in different ways revolutionary ideas about the relationship between the body and particularly the nerves and senses and human feeling, thought, and action. So we really started to understand that everything that we think and feel has to do with our nervous system and our senses. You can't think and feel without those things. So in other words, your eyes, ears, touch, and all of that, though these are the conduits between outside the world and inside the body. And those conduits, the senses, and then on the inside, the whole nervous system is all about feelings and thoughts and actions and all of that. And the brain, they understood then, and we do now, was established as the physical seat of thought. The nerves as the conduit between brain and world, and the senses as the portal to that outside world. And there's lots of really interesting literary criticism, historical literary criticism about this. Georges Rousseau is one of those. He's got a big book called Nervous Acts, and he makes the point that we identified the scientific and medical moorings of what it means to be human, of the human body and the human self. And this in turn produces a culture of sensibility and a whole literature of sensibility. And sensibility is a term in the 18th century which really has to do with sensation, with the body, with understanding that, and understanding that our supposed higher qualities like sympathy, what are our higher qualities? Sympathy, all the virtues, the desire to be good, the cooperative self, all that sort of stuff comes from how we engage with the world. Okay, so skipping forward some centuries, 17th, 18th to the 19th century, but all through this long sweep of history, there's lots and lots of exciting work in all kinds of fields, including the arts and the humanities, about trying to understand all the fine bits of this machine that is the body, that is engaged emotionally and sympathetically with the world. And here's an example. This is Duchenne de Boulogne's experiments with human emotion, for instance, trying to understand how there is the outside world, we experience it through our sensations, all the stuff goes on inside in the mind, and we express it then outwardly with expression, our facial expression, bodily expression. And so here he wants to understand the physiological, anatomical mechanisms that make human expression possible. So he's giving electricity to various facial muscles in order to make certain affects and or emotions. We have to remember these are nebulous, slippery terms. So here we've got terror and horror on the one side, and the woman showing us cruelty, dressed as Lady Macbeth. Okay, now moving on through these sort of big topics, or big subtopics, I should say. Affect obviously has a lot to do with ideas about the self and identity, which I've said a few times now, the face, which we have just seen, and then, of course, the body. So painters obviously are really interested in sculptors through history and how all these things work together. And I'm going to quote Sylvan Tompkins here because it's such a brilliant little quote. The self lives, he says, where it exposes itself and where it receives similar exposure from others. So here is where we expose ourselves, the external body, and in particular the face. And this is also where we receive exposure from others. We look, we smell, we touch, not so much touching, a lot of looking, and we hear others up on the surface, and then we take them into our bodies, and this whole process. And so artists, even before obviously something like affect theory existed, but an artist like Caravaggio in the 17th century, for instance, is really, really intently focused on how to get audiences to be affected by affective scenes in his paintings. And so look at the attention given to the expressions on those faces of those figures. There we have Christ. Look at the brow. Look at the heavily shaded eyes. Look at the line he's got right here. Look at the downturned and darkened lips. Look at how that light, where it's coming from, we don't know, but it glints off that armor like crazy, but it's there on the forehead of Christ, and there on the forehead directly across from him, from somebody who we think, perhaps from this image, is betraying him. And look at the hand, the outstretched hand just behind Christ's face or head. And then look at the hands of Christ, the way they're folded. Okay, and we could go on and on with reading this image, but it is remarkable in the way it communicates emotion to us and the way it uses certain techniques like the dark shadow and intense bits of light. So writers are doing this a similar thing too, which we can talk about. Okay. So affect is connected to language, then as well as the body. So visual languages and obviously literary language. Affect is, Brian Massumi says, abstract because it cannot be fully realized in language. So there's something here too that we might want to think about embodiedness and affect as embodied. And so this is a what? Pre-linguistic thing? Is that possible? And after post-structuralism, do we believe in things that are pre-linguistic? Something to think about. But slightly separate from language or shaped by language, but then also, as it says here, not fully realized in language, because affect is always prior to and or outside of consciousness, and besides which, we all know that if you see a remarkable thing, and you try to describe it with language or try to write it, even more difficult to get your audience to understand, to feel, to see. You know how difficult that can be. So there's questions here about the relationship to language to affect. And so affect, we could also say, emerges from the body's grammar. There is a language that our bodies are speaking all the time. There's visceral perception, visceral in the body perception of affect. And Simon O'Sullivan says affects can be described as extra discursive, outside of language, and extra textual, outside of language. Affects are immanent to matter. Matter as in the material, they are certainly immanent to experience. So that's something to think about, and something which is unsolved at this point. You know, what is the relationship between language and affect? Okay, and you could say that meaning is what we get. It's the effect of affects. So we make meaning through this kind of emotional process. So affect, now let's put some more terms together here. Affect, language, the body, and another thing to think about is pain in particular, because I just, sort of said about how difficult it is to get language to express what we want to express sometimes, but pain and intense pain whether that be physical or mental or psychological, is one of those things that a lot of theorists have said is very difficult to express. And one of the sort of, is cutting edge the right word? One of the influential writers on this is Elaine Scarry in her book Body and Pain of 1987, says that physical pain has no voice. But when it at last finds a voice, it begins to tell a story. And the story that it tells is about the inseparability of three subjects. One, how difficult it is to express physical pain. Two, the political and perceptual complications that arise as a result of that difficulty. How can you get people to understand real physical pain in order that things might change, like, say, in times of war? And three, the nature of both material and verbal expressibility and nature of human creation. All these things are embedded. So really the thesis, Scarry's thesis, her argument is that pain is very difficult to express in language, but important that we try to do so for obvious reasons. Okay, so I'm going to actually stop there because I think probably if I look, I've gone on endlessly. Let me just see. Yes, I have 21 and a half minutes. Okay, see you for lecture 2.